1860. That's the number I want you to hold in your mind. Not a range, not an era. A single year. 3 expeditions. American, British, French. Each independently sailed to the same frozen continent, Antarctica, within months of one another. I accepted that for years. Parallel exploration. The age of discovery. Makes sense on the surface. Then I found a single line buried in a footnote of Wilkes's suppressed expedition log, a line that his superiors redacted in the published version. 7 words. Formations inconsistent with any natural process known. 50 years later, a survivor of the first expedition to overwinter on Antarctica, led by a Norwegian-British explorer named Borchgrevink, gave a single interview describing his crew seeing cities beneath the ice. That section wasn't translated into English for 60 years. That's when I stopped being able to look away. Let's establish what we know, what the textbooks tell us, what the official record, such as it is, allows. Charles Wilkes, American naval officer. He departed in August 1836, leading a squadron of 6 vessels. He charted over 1,600 miles of Antarctic coastline and returned in 1840. His report, the one he filed, was disputed almost immediately by his own officers. Not disputed for being too bold, disputed for being incomplete. His charts contained features, formations. His officers noted discrepancies in what the official log recorded versus what crew members described in private correspondence, later recovered by researchers. Wilkes faced court-martial upon his return, not once, multiple times over the course of his career. He was accused of illegal punishment of crew, of conduct unbecoming. He was acquitted on most charges, but he spent the next several decades of his life buried in bureaucratic obscurity. His Antarctic findings overshadowed, his personal journals heavily edited before publication. Dumont d'Urville departed Toulon in September 1837. His mission ostensibly was to push further south than any French vessel had gone before, to claim territory, to advance science, to plant the tricolor in ice. He returned in November 1840. He published his accounts. A daily land, named for his wife, was charted. He is remembered. He is celebrated. In May 1840, he boarded a train at Versailles with his wife and son. The train derailed. The fire that followed was catastrophic. D'Urville, his wife, his son did not survive. Much of the material he'd been traveling with, including expedition documents he was reportedly transporting for review, gone. Not lost at sea, not destroyed in a naval warehouse fire, on a train in France, 2 years after returning from Antarctica. I'm not saying that means anything. I want to be precise about that. Train accidents happen. Tragedy is not conspiracy. But I ask you to hold that detail. Just hold it. And James Clark Ross, the most decorated of the 3. He reached what would be named the Ross Ice Shelf, a wall of ice the height of the White Cliffs of Dover, stretching for hundreds of miles. He described it as impenetrable, as staggering, as something that stopped him absolutely. His published accounts are considered models of Victorian scientific restraint, precise, methodical, dispassionate. And yet, his crew logs, the raw ones filed with the Admiralty, the ones that took researchers decades to fully access, contain passages that don't appear anywhere in the official narrative. References to what one officer described only as geometric anomalies in the exposed rock faces. References in at least 2 independent crew journals to what sounds like structured stone. Not ice, stone. If you follow the thread further, and once you start, it becomes genuinely difficult to stop. You arrive at Carsten Borchgrevink, Norwegian-British explorer. He was part of a whaling expedition in 1895 that became, by most accounts, the first group to actually land on the Antarctic continent. Not just chart it from offshore, not just approach and retreat. Land. Stand on it. Walk. He returned in 1898 with a dedicated scientific expedition, the Southern Cross Expedition, and spent the winter of 1899 on the continent, the first humans to deliberately overwinter in Antarctica. What did he find? Here is where the official record does something I've come to recognize. It narrows. It becomes very specific about certain things. The cold, the isolation, the biological samples, the meteorological measurements, and very vague, almost deliberately vague, about others. One of his crew, a zoologist named Nikolai Hansen, died during the expedition. The official cause, a digestive condition. He was 29 years old. He was buried on a ridge overlooking the bay. His death receives one paragraph in most historical accounts. Another crew member returned from the expedition and spent the rest of his life declining to speak publicly about what he'd experienced. He gave one interview, to a Norwegian newspaper in 1903. The relevant section was not translated into English for nearly 60 years. When it finally was, it described crew members experiencing what the interviewer gently called episodes of geographic fixation. That is, crew members who became convinced they could see something beneath the ice. Something organized. Something that shouldn't be there. The deeper you go into Borchgrevink's own writings, the more you notice a particular pattern in his language. He is precise about logistics. He is detailed about wildlife. He becomes strangely abstract, almost poetic, almost evasive when describing the interior geology. When describing what the rock looked like where the wind had scoured the ice away. When describing what the formations reminded him of, he never finishes those sentences. Not once. Not metaphorically, literally. In at least 3 known passages from his private correspondence, the sentence describing the rock formations is either cut short, transitions abruptly to a different subject, or exists in a version that differs markedly from the version filed with his expedition sponsors. If you're finding this investigation useful, if these patterns are raising questions you haven't seen raised elsewhere, consider sharing this work. The deeper this kind of scrutiny reaches, the harder it becomes to ignore. Let's talk about what the physical record actually suggests. Antarctica is not uniformly covered in ice. This is well established. There are exposed rock regions, nunataks they're called, where geology is accessible, where you can examine the actual surface of the continent, where, under the right conditions of wind and drift, you can see what lies beneath the ice sheet at the margins. Early expedition members described repeatedly formations in these exposed zones that struck them as anomalous. The language varies. Peculiar regularity, unusual right-angle faces, stone arrangements unlike natural weathering patterns. But the theme repeats with an unsettling precision across multiple independent accounts from multiple expeditions spanning several decades. Regular angles, repeated geometric intervals. Stone that, in the words of one crew member whose journal was published privately by his family in 1931 and has never been incorporated into mainstream historical literature, did not break the way stone breaks. Now, geologists will tell us about columnar basalt. They'll explain frost wedging, differential erosion, the natural tendency of certain volcanic rocks to cleave in angular patterns. I know that. I've read those explanations. And I want to be fair. Those explanations account for a great deal of what early explorers may have found disorienting in an environment unlike anything they'd ever seen. But here is the point where the orthodox explanation becomes harder to sustain. It's not the angles, it's the distribution. Multiple crew members from multiple expeditions, men who had never met, who in some cases were citizens of actively competing nations, who had no mechanism for coordinating their accounts, described similar formations in different geographic locations along the Antarctic coast. Not the same location, different locations separated by hundreds of miles. If it's natural geology, columnar basalt, frost fracture, erosion, then that's interesting, but unremarkable. Antarctic geology is relatively uniform in places. Fine, but if you overlay the approximate locations described in these various accounts, a pattern emerges that doesn't map neatly onto known geological formations. The descriptions cluster in ways that suggest, and I want to be careful here, I want to use the word suggest, distribution, intentional placement, spacing, not a quarry, not a single building, something larger, something that would require you to step back, very far back, to perceive as a whole. And here is where this becomes genuinely impossible to brush aside. For the official history to hold, for the natural geology plus overexcited explorers explanation to fully account for what we find in these records, you need to explain something. You need to explain why 3 separate governments in the same decade, with no coordinated communication, all chose to heavily redact, delay, dispute, or simply never fully publish the raw reports from their Antarctic expeditions. The United States did not publish Wilkes's complete charts for years. Some were reclassified. The British Admiralty received Ross's full logs, and a substantial portion of what his officers separately filed was not publicly catalogued until the 20th century. France published d'Urville's account, but the account itself has been noted by at least 2 French historians as diverging from surviving crew diaries in specific, recurring ways. Always the same kinds of divergence. The geological observations, the descriptions of the coastline's interior features, the character of what the exposed rock looked like. Not the temperature readings, not the biological specimens, not the navigational data, the rocks. Why the rocks? 3 nations, no shared communication, all suppressing the same category of information. The official explanation doesn't just strain here, it collapses entirely. Because for this to be coincidence, you'd need to believe that 3 separate governments, operating in competitive isolation, all independently decided that the geological features of Antarctica were too sensitive to publish accurately, for reasons none of them ever formally articulated within the same 20-year window. Or something else, something they all saw or were told about that required the same response. Here is where I have to be honest about the limits of what I can demonstrate versus what I can only gesture toward. There is a body of research, not fringe research, not anonymous internet speculation, but work by architectural historians, by geographers, by scholars of cartographic anomalies, that has been quietly building a case for the existence of a prior world-spanning civilization whose reach was substantially broader and whose erasure was substantially more deliberate than mainstream history acknowledges. You will have encountered this material under various names. The maps produced before formal exploration, the Piri Reis map, the Orontius Phineus map, which appear to depict Antarctic coastlines with a specificity that shouldn't have been possible. Coastlines that match sub-ice topography only confirmed by 20th century sonar. Coastlines depicted without the ice that now covers them. How? The standard answer, that these maps were copied from older sources, possibly compiled from explorers whose records are now lost, is itself an admission. It admits that there existed cartographic knowledge of Antarctica before the expeditions we recognize as first contact. It admits that someone had been there, had mapped it, had left records detailed enough that European cartographers in the 16th century could reproduce them with recognizable accuracy. It just doesn't ask who. And here is where the thread from 1840 connects to something much larger. If there existed, at some point prior to recorded history, or prior to the history we are permitted to access, a civilization operating at a scale capable of worldwide presence, capable of construction in extreme environments, capable of leaving traces in the rock that would still be visible to 19th century naval officers, even through accumulated centuries of ice and weathering, then the question isn't whether Antarctica was inhabited. The question is when it stopped being inhabited. And the question after that is why the record of its habitation was so thoroughly, so consistently, so erased on a worldwide scale. Not suppressed in one country, not buried by one government, erased across languages, across archives, across the official histories of nations that have spent centuries in competition with each other, and yet somehow arrived at the same silence on this single subject. That uniformity of silence is itself a form of evidence. I want to return to the human element for a moment, because this isn't just an archival mystery. It's a story about what these expeditions did to the men on them. The rate of psychological distress among early Antarctic expedition crew is not something widely discussed in mainstream historical literature, but it's documented. Multiple crew members from the Wilkes expedition were described in ship records as suffering from what the surgeons of the day called polar madness, a broad diagnosis that covered everything from simple cabin fever to episodes of acute hallucinatory crisis. Some of these men described visions, cities, architecture in the ice. Now I know what the rational response to that is: isolation, hypoxia, the psychological strain of extreme environment, the visual distortions caused by Antarctic light phenomena, fata morgana, the mirage effect that polar explorers are well documented to have experienced, in which distant ice can appear to take on the shapes of towers, walls, buildings. All of that is real. All of that is documented. I'm not dismissing it. But here is what I keep returning to. The visions these crew members reported were not random. They were not generic castles or European cityscapes transposed onto the ice. The architectural descriptions that survived in private letters, in unpublished journals, in the one or two accounts that made it into print before being quietly discontinued, those descriptions have a specific character: massive scale, non-European proportion, stone rather than timber or brick, layout suggesting not individual buildings, but planned arrangements, districts, grids, and they described it as buried, visible only in fragments, as if whatever they were seeing, whether by mirage or hallucination or something else entirely, was the exposed corner of something incomprehensibly larger, still concealed beneath the ice. One officer, I'll decline to name him because his family is still identifiable, wrote in a letter to his brother that he had seen from the ship's deck a sequence of walls extending along the cliff face for a distance he could not estimate, and bearing no resemblance to any formation he was able to attribute to nature or weather. He wrote that he had reported it to his commanding officer. He wrote that he was told to strike it from his personal log. He wrote that he did not strike it from the letter. The letter was donated to a regional archive by his descendants in 1974. It has been cited in exactly one academic paper. That paper was never republished after its initial appearance in a specialist journal that folded 2 years later. What strikes me, the longer I sit with this material, isn't the individual anomalies. Any single one of these could be explained. Any individual discrepancy, any single redaction, any one explorer's breakdown or unexplained death or cryptic letter, taken alone, each of these is manageable. Historical noise. It's the pattern. Not the geology alone, not the simultaneous expeditions alone, not the suppressed reports alone, not the deaths alone, not the raving crew members alone, not the pre-ice maps alone. All of it, together, pointing in the same direction across a century of Antarctic engagement, across governments that despised each other, across languages and archives and institutional interests that had every reason to compete and no apparent reason to cooperate, and yet cooperating, or at least converging on a single uniform absence. The question isn't who made the decision. Maybe no single person did. Maybe the decision made itself, the way certain truths, if they are large enough and disruptive enough, generate their own institutional gravity toward erasure. Not conspiracy in the movie sense, something slower, something more diffuse, something that operates through the ordinary human instinct to protect the version of history that allows everything else to continue functioning. Because if what these expedition members saw was real, if the formations were architectural, if the scale was what the descriptions suggest, if the geographic distribution maps onto something intentional, then the implications don't stop at Antarctica. They ripple backward through everything, every timeline, every assumption about the age and origin and reach of human civilization, every map, every founding myth of every nation that sent ships to that ice. Once you allow that possibility in, even as a question, even as a hypothesis held lightly and provisionally, once you see the shape of what the evidence suggests, you understand why the silence is so total, and so coordinated, and so old. 3 expeditions. 1. Silence. What did they find on that coastline that required 3 competing nations to independently arrive at the same omission? What did the rock look like in those scoured margins, where the wind had pulled the ice away that made experienced naval officers reach for language they couldn't quite complete? Why do the pre-colonial maps know what they shouldn't know? Why do the men who saw it most closely come back changed? Some of them broken, some of them silent, some of them dead before they could be properly questioned. What is the relationship between those geometric distributions and the ones researchers have been documenting quietly in dozens of other locations across the Earth? The architectural uniformities, the impossible coordination, the civilization-scale evidence that appears wherever someone looks carefully enough and is willing to write down what they actually see rather than what they've been told to see. I don't know. I genuinely don't know, and I want to be careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. But I know what the evidence suggests. I know what it feels like to read these accounts in sequence, to watch the same absence repeat itself across decades, across languages, across the institutional memories of governments that should have no reason to agree on anything. It feels like a door that someone very carefully closed. And somewhere on the other side of it, under ice that has been thickening for centuries, over stone that may or may not have been shaped by hands we have no name for, the answer is still there, waiting for whoever is willing to ask the question loudly enough.